In October of 1974, on a lonely stretch of road just outside Toowoomba, Queensland, a police officer named Ian Hamilton stood in the dark and listened to a woman scream. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she was. All he had was a phone call from two caretakers at a nearby youth camp who said they'd been hearing it for 20 minutes straight, a sound one of them would later describe as the most terrifying thing he'd ever heard in his life.
Hamilton and his partner drove out. They walked the range in the dark, following a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then it stopped. They never found her that night. It would be almost 2 years before anyone found her at all. This is the story of two young nurses who set out to hitchhike home after a holiday and never arrived. It's a story about a killing so brutal that police believed, for a while, that it must be the work of Australia's most feared unidentified predator. And it's a story about what happens when an entire town decides together to keep a secret and very nearly succeeds. I Am Part 1. The holiday Lorraine Wilson was 20 years old in 1974. She was training to become a nurse in Sydney, the kind of steady, practical career her family was proud of. She was close with her relatives, especially an aunt who'd become something like a second mother to her, and she had the sensible streak you'd expect from someone who spent her days on hospital wards. She planned things out. She kept people updated on where she was, and she didn't take foolish risks. Wendy Evans was younger, only 16, and the two had become close through their nursing training. Wendy had the kind of restless energy you'd expect from a teenager who just discovered a wider world outside her hometown. Where Lorraine was the more cautious of the pair, Wendy was game for adventure. Together, they made a good traveling combination, one of them watching the clock, the other one keeping things fun. In the spring of 1974, the two young women decided to use their break from work to see the country. It wasn't an unusual thing to do. Australia in the 70s had a strong hitchhiking culture. Backpackers and young travelers moved around the coastline that way as a matter of course, trusting strangers for lifts the way people trusted the postal service to deliver a letter. It wasn't reckless. It was just how a lot of young Australians got around when they didn't have much money. Lorraine and Wendy planned a loop out of Sydney, up through New South Wales into Queensland, taking in the sights, staying with family along the way. It was meant to be a few carefree weeks before they went back to the wards, back to bedpans and early shifts and hospital corridors. Everything went smoothly enough until Lorraine's car broke down partway through the trip. It needed repairs, and the mechanic told her it wouldn't be ready for over a week. That was a problem, because both women were due back at work in Sydney by the 10th of October. Wendy, in particular, couldn't afford to lose her job over a mechanical fault 2 states away. So the two of them made a decision that, in hindsight, is almost unbearable to think about. Rather than wait around for the car, they'd hitchhike the rest of the way. It was the same method plenty of travelers used, the same method they themselves had probably used already on this very trip. There was no reason, in October 1974, for either of them to think it was especially dangerous. It was just how you got from A to B. On the 6th of October, Lorraine and Wendy set off on foot, planning to hitch their way toward Brisbane and from there home. They were never seen alive again. Part 2. The screams on the range that same evening, the 6th of October, the caretakers at a youth camp on the Toowoomba range heard something that unsettled them enough to call the police. A woman screaming. Not once, not briefly, but continuously, for what they estimated to be 20 minutes. When Constable Ian Hamilton and his partner arrived, they walked out from the camp with the caretakers, roughly 80 meters up the range, trying to work out where the sound was coming from. At first, they heard nothing. Then, after a few minutes of walking in the dark, the screaming started again, and Hamilton would later describe it as blood-curdling. The kind of sound that stays with a person. But the range at night is disorienting. Sound bounces off rock and travels strangely through bushland, and despite their best efforts, the officers couldn't pin down a direction. Eventually, the screaming stopped, and they had nothing to go on. No location, no name, no way to know that what they'd just heard was very likely the sound of Lorraine Wilson fighting for her life. It's one of the most haunting details in the entire case. Help was less than 100 meters away. It just didn't know where to look. Back in Sydney, the days ticked past without word from the two women. Lorraine's aunt, who had been expecting updates throughout the trip, grew increasingly uneasy when neither Lorraine nor Wendy turned up for work on the 10th of October as planned. It wasn't like Lorraine to go silent. On the 12th of October, 6 days after the screaming on the range, Lorraine's aunt reported both women missing. At that point, nobody connected the disappearance of two nursing students to a report of screaming on a rural road 2 states away. Why would they? There was no name attached to that scream. There was just a gap, 2 young women who should have come home and didn't. Part 3. A country on edge to understand why Lorraine and Wendy's disappearance caused such alarm. You need to understand what else was happening in Queensland at the time. Through the 1970s, a string of young women had gone missing or turned up dead after hitchhiking in the Brisbane and Gold Coast region. Several of them shared eerie similarities to each other. Similar ages, last seen thumbing a lift on a highway, found later, if they were found at all, badly beaten, and in some cases, evidence suggested they'd been sexually assaulted before they were killed. The press had given this unknown, uncaught figure a name that struck fear into every parent of a teenage daughter in the state: the Gold Coast hitchhiker murderer. So when 2 nursing students vanished after setting out to hitchhike from a rural New South Wales town toward Brisbane and simply never turned up again, it wasn't a leap for investigators or for the public to wonder whether they'd become victims 6 and 7 of the same killer. It fit the pattern. Young women, alone, hitchhiking gone. A reward was posted. Newspapers ran the story. And then, for a long, agonizing stretch of time, nothing happened at all. No bodies. No sightings. No suspects. Just 2 families waiting for news that refused to come. It would be almost 2 years before that silence broke. Part 4. Murphy's Creek in 1976, 2 years after Lorraine and Wendy vanished, human remains were discovered in bushland near the small township of Murphy's Creek in the foothills of the Toowoomba Range, not far at all from that youth camp where the screaming had been heard. Formal identification, given how much time had passed and the condition of the remains, took time and careful forensic work. But eventually it was confirmed. This was Lorraine Wilson and Wendy Evans, the 2 young women who had set out to hitchhike home 2 years earlier, had never made it more than a few kilometers from where they were last seen. What investigators found at the scene made it brutally clear this had not been a robbery gone wrong, or a single opportunistic attacker. There was evidence the 2 women had been bound, a detail that would go on to matter enormously years later, when forensic techniques caught up with what had been left behind. There was also a piece of physical evidence recovered near the site that seemed almost absurdly promising for the era: a man's silver signet ring, clearly not belonging to either victim. For a case that had, until then, consisted of nothing but a scream nobody could locate and 2 families refusing to give up hope, this felt like a turning point. A ring. Physical restraints. A crime scene at last that could be processed. And yet, despite the discovery, despite the reward, despite the ring, the case went cold. Not because nobody had suspicions. As it would turn out decades later, plenty of people in and around Murphy's Creek had more than suspicions. They had knowledge. What they didn't have was any intention of sharing it with police. Part 5. A Code of Silence. Murphy's Creek was, in the 1970s, a small rural community, the kind of place where everybody's connected to everybody else, one way or another, through family or work or simple proximity. And within that community, according to evidence that would only surface decades later, there existed a tight, interconnected group of local men, among them members of the extended Hilton and Laurie families, who were, allegedly, involved in what happened to Lorraine and Wendy on the night of the 6th of October. For years, decades, really, that alleged involvement stayed buried under something close to an oath of silence. Witnesses who came forward much later described a community bound by fear and loyalty in equal measure. People who knew, or half knew, or had heard things secondhand, but who kept it to themselves because speaking up felt more dangerous than staying quiet. It's worth pausing here to say plainly what the record actually shows, because this is a case that has never resulted in a criminal conviction. Over the following decades, police received a number of accounts, some direct, some hearsay, filtered through friends, relatives, and acquaintances of the men allegedly involved, describing a horrifying night in which multiple men, arriving in more than one car, were said to have picked up Lorraine and Wendy on the road, taken them into the bush, and subjected them to a prolonged sexual assault before killing them. According to one account that emerged years afterward, a man named Donald Laurie, while unwell and hospitalized, allegedly told a friend something to the effect of, "We killed the nurses. I was there. I didn't do it." He was said to have named others as being present, men who went by nicknames as much as their given names, the kind of informal handles that get attached to people in small towns. Wayne, Boogie, Hilton. Alan Unjai, Laurie. Alan Shorty, Laurie. Larry Charles. Another witness recalled seeing one of those men, Larry Charles, uncharacteristically break down crying on an anniversary of the murders, reportedly saying only that it was 2 years to the day since them girls got killed at Murphy's Creek. When asked what was wrong, that was as far as he'd go. None of this, on its own, constitutes proof in a court of law, and it's important to say clearly that none of the men named through these accounts has ever been convicted in relation to Lorraine and Wendy's deaths. But taken together, the accumulated weight of witness statements, gathered by police and later examined in painstaking detail at a coronial inquest, painted a disturbing and consistent picture of what many believed had actually happened on that road, versus the Gold Coast hitchhiker theory the public had been fed for years. Part 6. What the evidence couldn't say. Here's the frustrating truth about this case. For a long time, the physical evidence simply couldn't keep pace with what witnesses were describing. Take the cord allegedly used to bind Lorraine and Wendy at the scene. By the time forensic science had advanced enough to potentially extract DNA from an item like that, decades after the fact, investigators tested it, hoping it might finally deliver the kind of undeniable proof that could support a prosecution. The results came back negative. Whatever biological trace might once have been present had simply degraded too much over the years to be of use. Then there was the ring, that silver men's signet ring found near the remains back in 1976, a detail investigators had always considered one of their most promising leads, given that Wayne, Boogie, Hilton was known by people who knew him to wear a similar one. But by the time police went looking for it decades later, during a full forensic review of the case, they discovered the ring had gone missing from evidence entirely. Along with it, other physical evidence had either been lost over the years or was destroyed around 2010. A decision that, with the benefit of hindsight, looks almost unbelievable given the case was still an open, unsolved double homicide with an active 6-figure reward attached to it. Even the eyewitness details that did exist were frustratingly inconsistent. Some witnesses recalled the getaway vehicle as an A Holden, Others were certain it was an E.J. Holden. Two models similar enough to be mixed up by anyone who wasn't a dedicated car enthusiast, but different enough to matter when you're trying to build a case. Descriptions of the men involved varied from account to account too, making it genuinely difficult, even decades later, to work out precisely which individual had allegedly done which specific act on that night, in a crime that witnesses agreed involved multiple perpetrators moving in and out of the scene across several hours. It's the kind of investigative nightmare that keeps detectives up at night. A case where you can be reasonably confident, in broad strokes, about who was involved and roughly what happened, but where the specific evidentiary threshold required to charge someone with murder or rape, decades after the fact, with witnesses who are elderly, reluctant, or now deceased themselves, becomes almost impossible to clear. Part 7. The long road to an inquest. For decades, Lorraine and Wendy's families lived with a particular kind of grief. Not just the loss of two young women with their whole lives ahead of them, but the added weight of knowing that somewhere out there, people who knew what had happened were choosing to stay silent. It wasn't until the 2000s that the case saw real, renewed momentum. Cold case detectives revisited the file. New witnesses, some of them people who'd grown up hearing whispers about Murphy's Creek their whole lives and had finally decided they couldn't carry it any longer, came forward. Others, interviewed as part of the renewed investigation, gave statements that filled in pieces of the picture that had never been on the record before. By 2013, there was enough accumulated evidence, witness statements, forensic reviews, decades of investigative work, to warrant a formal coronial inquest into the deaths of Wendy Joy Evans and Lorraine Ruth Wilson. Hearings were held in Toowoomba over 4 days in April of that year, with a further hearing in Brisbane in June. 29 witnesses gave evidence. Several people connected to the case, including relatives of some of the men named in witness accounts, were granted leave to appear and be legally represented, a sign of just how seriously their alleged connection to the case was being treated. And, as often happens once an inquest becomes public, even more witnesses came forward once the hearings were underway. People who'd apparently been waiting to see whether this would actually go anywhere before they were willing to speak. The coroner's findings, delivered afterward, laid out in careful, methodical detail the evidence gathered against multiple men from the Hilton and Laurie families and their associates, evidence of admissions, of behavior on the night in question, of blood allegedly found in a car that was hurriedly cleaned the following morning. It was, by any measure, a damning document. But a coronial inquest is not a criminal trial. It can identify who a coroner believes was likely involved. It cannot convict anyone of anything. To date, more than 50 years after Lorraine Wilson and Wendy Evans set out to hitchhike home from a country town in New South Wales, nobody has ever been charged with their murders. Part 8. What remains? There's a version of this story that would end differently. A version where the forensic evidence survived intact, where a definitive DNA match was made to the ring or the cord, where the men whose names surface again and again in witness statements were made to answer for it in a courtroom instead of a coroner's report. That isn't the story we have. What we do have is this: 2 young women, barely out of their teens, who did nothing more unusual than try to get home for work on time. A community that, for whatever mixture of fear, loyalty, and self-preservation, chose collective silence over truth for the better part of 40 years. And a family, Lorraine's aunt among them, who spent 5 decades waiting for an answer that the justice system, for all its careful process, still hasn't been able to deliver. The case remains formally unsolved. A reward, one of the largest ever offered for a homicide in Queensland's history, still stands. And there are still people alive today, in Murphy's Creek and beyond, who almost certainly know more than they've ever told police. Somewhere there's still a family keeping a page online dedicated to nothing but this: a request, half a century old now, for anyone who knows something to finally say it out loud. Because in the end, that's what this case has always come down to. Not a lack of evidence that something terrible happened on the Toowoomba Range on the 6th of October, 1974. There's never been much doubt about that. What's been missing for 50 years is simply somebody willing to say the truth in a room where it actually counts. Lorraine Wilson was 20 years old. Wendy Evans was 16. They were nursing students on their way home from a holiday, and all they wanted was a lift.